This is Book Public from Texas Public Radio. I'm Yvette Benavides. On today's episode, I speak with Marisa Silver about her novel, At Last. Sometimes in life, you're forced into a closeness with a stranger who becomes part of your family. The arrangement isn't always easy to negotiate. In Marisa Silver's latest novel, At Last, Helene and Evelyn are two women whose children marry. They have a granddaughter, Francie, in common. They become bound together by this simple fact. In chapters with alternating narrators, we learn all about them. We learn about Helene, who became an only child after losing a brother and a sister. She marries an older man, a doctor, who has also known tragedy in his life. The one thing Helene has is her only child, Tom. Evelyn's had a hard Scrabble life, and we learn about the details of the struggle she has known. We follow all these lives and get to know the character of Francie, too. The novel covers so many decades and eras. We follow them easily and eagerly. What does it mean to be connected to someone because you have to be and have no choice? Where do we find meaning in this kind of kinship? The women in this novel represent so many diverse ideas about what it means to be a woman, a wife, a mother, a friend. What it means to carry the stories of our mothers and grandmothers and daughters, about what we owe to each other and what we deserve and expect for ourselves through it all. I spoke to Marisa Silver about her novel, At Last. At Last.
At Last.
At Last. Tell me about this novel.
I started this novel some years ago, just beginning to write these two women. And I think that I became interested in this idea that people are thrown into one another's lives as in-laws, or in many different ways, completely unbidden, but that there's a kind of requirement of intimacy which is not always welcome. And I think it stemmed from a conversation, a long, long time ago when I was a child, very young. My sister and I, when my parents would travel, they would leave us in the care of our grandmothers, and we would spend, say 4 days with one grandmother, and then that one would take us to the other ones for the final 4 days. When I was about 4 and my older sister was a couple years older, one of my grandmothers put us in the back of her car to take us to the other ones. And she turned around and she said to us, "You love me more than your other grandmother, don't you?" And I remember that moment decades and decades later. I remember as a young child being really frightened by that question. Like, I did not understand it. I felt like there was something I was supposed to say or be responsible for that was way too sophisticated or complicated for me to understand. And I've always kind of wondered about that. What would make a person say that to a young child? And what was the kind of need embedded in that question, and the desire to be the better loved, or where did that come from? And I didn't write a novel about my two grandmothers because I don't think I knew them well enough to be able to source from their own lives. But I created these two characters, Evelyn and Helene, who are would never under any circumstances be friends, any other circumstances, but they're brought into one another's lives when their children marry. And they have this very uneasy, at times extremely competitive relationship with one another over the course of their lives. And I sort of felt like it would be interesting to track that relationship and to see how it ebbed and flowed, and how that need for love and attention and how it mattered to them to be the chosen one, and how that changed over the course of their lives. And then because it's a novel that really covers 70 years of these women's lives, it becomes secondarily a novel about, the changing roles of women over the course of the last century and into this one, how women perceive themselves, what they thought their possibilities were, how the next generation of women had a different kind of perception. So it became, in a very sort of shadowy way, a story of the changing nature of women's self-perception over the course of the century.
Oh my gosh, there's so much I want to ask you about what you said. But the first thing is, I remember Sandra Cisneros, I think it's in Caramelo, one of her books, where a father says to his daughter, who do you like more, your mother or me? This kind of question. And I can see a parent asking the kid that question the way a kid might say about the siblings, to the mother, who do you like, who's your favorite kid? But a grandmother, wow, that's really, that's really something.
I think it's pretty something for a parent to say to a kid also. And
Yeah.
why Sandra Cisneros would write it because it's so, I mean, she's so incredible. But I think that as I got to know these characters, as I wrote them, I realized that they both had suffered a lot of loss in their lives. They're both widows. They both began their lives with a really narrow idea of what their possibilities were. And I think that their competition over their granddaughter's love is also a competition over this, well, how can I say it? A need for them to assert some kind of importance, self-importance, which may be true for, love in general, that, if we're loved, then we feel important. But I think for them, it's very much tied to the kinds of restrictions that were placed on what their ideas of themselves and their possibilities could be growing up in the early part of the 20th century. So I think there's a double layer of it. I mean, I think they both want to be the better loved because they don't like each other very much, and they want to they want to be the more special. But I think there's also a way in which that competition has a lot to do with the way they're subtly changing in their understanding of the choices that they made and what might not have happened for them in their lives.
Yes, the choices that they made, because we do get to see them in their younger years. This is one of the magical things about this book is that the chapters, first of all, you have titles for the chapters, which is something I love in novels. And they seem quite standalone. I mean, you could really just like dive into one and immerse yourself in it. And it's just this great story in and of itself, this sort of fully formed story in and of itself. And I love that about it. But you do learn about their childhood. You learn about their own families. And you really come to begin to understand why, when each of them is in this particular station in life as a grandparent, you can start to sort of the way I do with my own mother or with people that I know, is to try to understand, how did we get here? What went on in the past? And it's just, it's fascinating.
I think what's interesting also is that we tend not to, well, maybe this is too general a story and I should just talk a statement and I'll just talk about myself, but we don't really, or I haven't really investigated my grandparents as actual full-blooded human beings, partly because I don't have access to them as fully as I do my parents. I think grandparents are sort of represent something, in the family construct, and they generally represent a kind of accepting, loving backstop, for all the what might be going on in the immediate family. But I think that we don't tend to sort of look at the grandparent generation and try to understand them as the people that they were, sort of separate from us in a certain way, to appreciate them. I mean, I think as young people, we don't even do that with our parents. And certainly, as you said, when we grow older, we begin to sort of have enough information about them and maybe enough perspective to be able to think of who they were, maybe even apart from us. But it was really, I love the idea of thinking about that, because it's, the child's view, where everyone is sort of there to service them in some way, the grandparent and the parent, is really a very limited view of who these people are. And so I think that writing about them gave me a chance to think about what that generation is about, separate and apart from family, just how these women think about themselves, how they created their sense of identity, how they, both of them in different ways sort of present a kind of idea of themselves that they want to present to the world. And that idea of themselves comes up against changing realities, and they must change in small and subtle ways. And I thought that was really, to me, very moving to try to see how they grappled with having to reconceive their notion of themselves in the world and within the family dynamic. In terms of the structure of it, I sort of conceived of the novel almost like, when my mother was at the end of her life and she suffered dementia, I would sit with her and go through photographs a lot. And that experience of sort of picking up a photograph and using that as an access into an experience, into a moment in history, that was something that I think I kind of envisioned as I was writing this book, that each chapter is almost a photograph that was seized from a pile of photographs or a page, from an album. And each photograph told a story of a certain time, and it told about these women and how they tried for love at a certain moment. I like the idea that in telling a story of a whole life, you can't tell a story of every moment of a life. You can only, so it's about how do you pick and choose the moments that tell more than that moment, that they tell us more. They beyond the story that's related in that particular moment.
That's so profound. I mean, it's like the sort of, the metonymy, like any one moment represents. I just love this idea. I wonder if you can you talk about Evelyn?
Yeah, Evelyn is the younger of the two grandmothers. She's about 10 years younger than the other. She's born on a farm outside of Omaha, moves into the city, and has a very kind of, she's from a very working class family, grows up, doesn't go to college, has a very kind of hard bitten, takes life at face value, doesn't have a lot of fantasy going on about what her life her life is what it is, and she sort of doesn't really truck in fantasy. She's like a pull up your pants and get on with it kind of woman. But I think that what you find throughout the course of the novel is that attitude masks a lot of vulnerability that she's quite uninterested in exposing, but that becomes exposed despite herself because of the things that happen in her life. And she's funny and she's sharp and she's not interested in playing nice or saying the nice thing. Whereas Helene, who comes from a different world, she comes from the South, and she really has created almost like a fantasy in her life because she's come into a marriage. She's a woman who doesn't get married until pretty late for the times. She's on the cusp of being an old maid, which is horrifying to her. And finally, she marries someone, and she's the one with the money, and she creates the fantasy and the public perception that she's the cared for woman. She sort of creates the relationship and the marriage that she wishes had come to her more easily. And so so she takes on a lot of attitudes and customs and manners of a kind of a doyenne and a woman whose life is full of lots of customs and attention to how things should be. And again, what we learn about her through the course of the novel, we learn what undergirds all that. So I think that both of the women, in very different ways, as I said, they present a kind of armor, and how that armor gets dinged and cracked is really part of the story of the novel.
I love these characters and I feel like I know them. I love how different Helene and Evelyn are, and they complement each other in a very interesting way. The thing about, in the chapter Tiny Meaningless Things, the thing about Evelyn, and I'd be remiss not to mention the scenes with the ironing. I mean, how can you make ironing so interesting in your writing? It's so good. Anyway, but the character of Scotty that's in Evelyn's life, I don't want to give a bunch of stuff away here about Scotty because I want readers who haven't yet read the book to encounter this. But there's something that emerges for me in this chapter with Evelyn, more generally about women that I know who are mysterious. I mean, I think this is what makes literature great. It's like the idea of how characters are mysteries and they remain mysteries because this is so true to life. But the thing about Evelyn also is that it's this armor that you're talking about. She does have self-awareness that I can perceive, but there's more to this idea of her mysteriousness, that she would allow Scotty to come into her house, into her space, and take things.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that what a lot of this book is about is how people reach for and allow love and connection into their lives, and sometimes they do it in the most unusual and surprising ways. And I think that Evelyn's relationship with this little boy, who never appears in the novel again, reveals itself to be sort of the conduit through which we learn so much about what, as I said before, what lies beneath her particular mask. And that it's this little boy, a very seemingly innocent little boy who really has no relationship to her beyond the fact that he lives on her floor.
Mm-hmm.
That apartment building that becomes the way in which certain things fall away, certain kind of ideas she had of herself fall away. That was really exciting to write. And in terms of the ironing, I love that you said that. I mean, one thing that I loved writing about in this book was I loved writing about ordinariness. These women are not heroic. They're not trailblazers. They don't, they're not learning, inventing anything, or they're kind of, their lives are pretty regular, like most of our lives. There's great meaning in all the things that we do, no matter how seemingly mundane they are. It's not just the big wins. We won a law case, or we are a doctor. It's like, what happens when you're ironing? Why are you ironing? How does that feel? Those are the kinds of ways that to me are really moving as ways to get inside the interiority of a character. I think sometimes maybe I'm more interested in that than in writing about people who are, blazing trails. There's a lot of beauty in what we think of as ordinariness.
I just love that about the characters in this book. I love this line in Tiny Meaningless Things because it harkens back to something in Hunger, where you write, when she would want to tell her daughters to wash their faces, never soap, only water, they'd ignore her, which only made her repeat her warnings to her maybe 3 times until they screamed at her and slammed their bedroom doors. They were young. How could they know the disaster of carelessness? And then when I read that, I immediately jumped back to chapter 2, Hunger, where it starts, when she was 14 years old, Evelyn Margolis stood in her backyard and waited for a boy to shoot an apple off her head. And it's like, the disaster of carelessness. And of course, we know what her mother does to punish her when that happens. But I just thought, I love this character so much, and the way that she really has learned a lot, and she really is a wise person, but she remains a mystery. She remains somebody who can allow Scotty to be quiet and move through those rooms and make his cinnamon toast and all of this, and observe him, and then watch him go down the hall back to his own space. But I don't know. There's just the small moments, the small, quiet moments here where it's not like, oh, these 2 grandmothers hate each other so ferociously and all this. And it's like, it's none of that. It's really about these 2 women, as you say, who are fated to be together somehow, are thrown into this situation by mere virtue of the fact that their children married. And they have also Francie in common. I wonder if you can talk about that.
I think it's interesting to think about a relationship between a grandmother and a grandchild in terms of how they do or do not honor or respect the parent. Francie's a child who grows up with different sorts of struggles, and in the beginning they seem mild. They get more challenging and more kind of life altering. It doesn't become to the level of tragedy, the grandmothers do and don't really understand what's happening with her. I mean, I think their psychological awareness is narrow. I think there's a moment in the novel where Evelyn, sends her daughter to a therapist, a psychologist, for a minute, and then sort of retracts it. I don't think she has any real interest in delving deep into this to psychology, nor does Helene. But I think that what they were watching their granddaughter go through as she gets older is challenging, is frightening. How they interact with her versus how her parents interact with her is also really interesting to me in terms of, like, is it the role of the grandparent to sit back and let a parent handle those things? Is it the role to stick your nose in and try to, offer what you think is the right thing to do? I mean, even though they're competitive with one another for the love of their granddaughter, they both really love their granddaughter. Mm-hmm. And I think I hope that really comes through. And Francie goes through things they don't understand. And I think it's interesting to see how they embrace what they don't understand. And I just want to go back to what you were saying about when you read something in a later chapter and then harken back to an earlier chapter. One of the really wonderfully fun things about this novel was that even though it's told in these fragments, there are ways in which questions that are posed in an early chapter are answered later on, or you see something planted in an early, even an object, a pair of glasses, the pair of glasses in the chapter you just mentioned called Tiny Meaningless Things, which becomes very important. You see it exist in a much earlier chapter. And I think there's a way in which, even though the story is fragmented, it's cohesive. There are echoes of things that happen. There are echoes of objects. There are lines that take on different meaning as the chapters progress. And that was really, really interesting to me to think about. And it wasn't just simply stylistic. It was like what are the threads of our lives that connect? What goes through time? What lasts through time, maybe in different forms, but is echoed through time. So that was a really wonderful thing for me to play with.
I noted that. I marveled at that, these sorts of, Chekhovian things that there you see one thing here, and then as you read, yes, there's an echo of something. There's a thread that's connecting the story from chapter to chapter. It's beautiful. I want to ask you this. Your book's been out there for a little while now. What has been your best interaction with a reader of your book where you just went like, ah, yes, it's out there and people are reading it. And I don't know. I don't even know what I'm asking about that, but I know you've been out there and you've been talking to people. And then what would you want readers to discover about this book and try to understand their own lives a little bit better because of Helene and Evelyn? I found such resonance in this book. I cannot even tell you. It's so beautiful to read a book like this. And I'm talking about sort of at all stages of life. Made me think about my mother and my grandmother. It made me think about my mother-in-law. And it made me think about my friendships at this age. And it really made me think about sort of the type of friend that I am at an older age. And I have to say, I'm a very different kind of friend than I was 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And I just found so interesting how these relationships are drawn. But anyway, what's been your best interaction with a reader of the book?
First of all, thank you. I'm so glad you saw so much. And I think one of the things I'm hearing again and again is how all of these characters, the women, the couple that marries, the grandchild, that they really sort of seem to live in people's imagination beyond the book. And that is a humongous, that is praise, because if you can create characters fiction is such a funny thing. We're inventing characters and we're using an artificial means of storytelling in order to try to express something about them. But when somebody ends a book and those characters are still alive for them, it's almost like a hat trick. Like how does that happen in fiction? I have that experience when I read books. It's I know it's not real. I know it's words on a page. I know that it's all invention, and yet those lives have dug down into me. They've made connections with me that are so profound that they allow me, as you're saying, to see the world or my relationships a little differently than I did before. And I think that's maybe I'm not interested in. I think, as you said, you invoke the word mysteries a lot, and that's a really important word to me, because I think that what's interesting about writing for me is not knowing an answer, but just asking a question and seeing how many ripples, you throw the stone into the water. Oh, that's the question, and what happens with all those ripples. And there is no knowing. I can't say that. I know my parents in some ways, or I knew them, but did I know them? There's so much I don't know about them. I think there's a part of the book where someone muses about that and says Francie, adult Francie, how little really she knows. Just some stories, right? Just some stories as though they were the chapters of this book. So I think that when people come to me and talk about, as you just did, how those ideas in the book are causing them to think about things in their life, or maybe just the reposition themselves a little bit vis-a-vis a question for you is about friendship, or that's incredible to me because that's what I love when I read a book is that I end it and I feel like I'm seeing something I thought I understood, but I'm seeing how much of it I don't understand and how much more magical that is.
Yeah, and it makes me think about the title of the book, At Last. It's really just the opposite of anything final. At last really doesn't mean at last and as in last. At last means here's a beginning. And because there are so many questions that I'm left with, and as you say, even if we find resonance, we're not reading a book to answer any questions. We are finding the questions and we're left to ponder them. And that's part of what is haunting me when I'm washing the dishes or doing something else and, Evelyn is still with me and I'm still thinking about Francie and I'm still thinking about this world. That's really it. I think that's really, really it.
Well, I mean, you're the kind of reader I am, and it's that feeling when you close a book and you just go like, ah, it's an ah of finishing something, and it's an ah of discovery, and the discovery goes onward, and I guess that's my aim, and if that is the feeling I leave one person with, then I feel like, okay, I did it.
You did. Marisa Silver, thank you so much for talking to me today. What a thrill. I'm so happy to get to talk to you again.
Thank you, Yvette. I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you so much for the kind words you said about the writing in the book.
Marisa Silver is the author of the novel, At Last. This has been Book Public from Texas Public Radio. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. I'm Yvette Benavides.